So as you walk through the exhibition, you will continue to see here and there some traces of Joseph Beuys' influence, legacy. Here actually we have these beautiful, very important pieces. You saw actually in the little cabinet curiosité dedicated to Beuys, all these objects, these multiples that Beuys was doing in order to provide greater accessibility to the art, multiple that people simply could afford because it was multiple. And here he did this beautiful piece. It's called A Rose for Democracy. It's a scientific test tube used as a vase for a rose. So there's many ways again to look at that. A test tube, is democracy just an experiment that could either succeed or fail? Think of the moment, the 70s, either in Germany or here in Portugal. It's done in 1973. The revolution in Portugal is in 1974. This Rose for Democracy actually might anticipate a turn in Portuguese history. And the rose, of course, is so symbolic. It has been for many years the symbol of the socialist movement, the Socialist Party, but it's also just a flower. And the flower which is extremely vulnerable. If you don't water it, if you do not care for it, it's going to just dry out and die. And we are in 2021 at a moment actually when this notion of democracy, if you look at many movements in Europe, many movements all over the world, in the United States, where this notion of democracy is in crisis, bringing us back to this notion of the test tube. Maybe it was just an experiment, and the jury is out to see if it will succeed. And that is just a rose, and the rose is a still life, and it connects to the history of painting, like you have here on the side with the Lourdes Castro, the shadow of a plant. And maybe, between the shadow of a plant and a Rose for Democracy, you might have a dynamic, and hopefully it's not going to take us to the shadow of democracy. So with the rose entering the exhibition, we can see that something is happening. The presence of nature. Of course, today, art, nature, environment are at the center of many conversation. But here in the 70s, you also have this movement connected to, I would say, the revolutionary movement and moment of the late 60s, this notion of going back to nature that was at the center of this philosophical and political moment at the end of the 60s and 70s. And if you look at what's happening in the world in the 70s, you have many different parallel movement happening. If you look at these photos here, what you see is actually an artist naked, and by being naked, of course, he's exposing his body. So again, you are in the late 60s, early 70s, when the notion of the liberation of the body, the liberation of sexuality is on every lips. It's the spirit of the time. And you also have a movement, and that you have an entire movement called body art, performance art, where the body is central. The body is the medium. The body is the matter that constitutes the art. The body is the measure of everything. But measuring what? Here, in this work, it's measuring art, it's measuring culture against nature, in front of nature. At this moment, in the late 60s and 70s, the movement called land art started to flourish all over the world. Artists in Europe, in the United States, really trying to create works of art, very often ephemeral work of art that wouldn't necessarily survive the passage of time. But the idea is really to integrate art, the process of art in nature, with very often extremely simple gestures. So if you look at the work of an artist who's not in this exhibition but present in the collection, like Richard Long, was just walking through nature. and documenting the walk through nature from point A to point B or Z. Same thing with a British artist named Hamish Fulton. You had in the United States someone like Nancy Holt building a concrete tunnel in the middle of the desert just to capture the movement of the sun. Here you have something, if you talk about the movement of the sun, you have something with Alberto Carnero almost similar. You have an artist in the forest who almost become, and that's my interpretation of the work, almost become this cadran solaire, this solar clock. And then you see at the top of the work, you almost have this sense of the cycle of nature, this system that the artist follow when he confronts his body at obviously different time of the day, in different places of nature, of the forest. It's interesting because we will see a little bit later in the exhibition that 40 years later, another artist will actually continue this tradition of very simple gesture, stage as performance, but this time, not in nature, but in an urban setting, in a city, in an urban space. Again, when you look at the exhibition, you will see, and I hope people will see it, that almost every work that we installed lead to another one. That it's really like actually the Georges Pinheiro painting with this musical score, that there is a score and we are in a sentence or in a paragraph that is telling us a very specific history of art from the late 20th century to the present, inspired by Joseph Beuys. But here we are in this moment where nature, or the element of nature, become at the center of the work. And here you also have, with this very simple work by Cildo Meireles, this notion of nature. And I think I mentioned early on the development of land art. The artist Robert Smithson was very interested in what he called a notion of non-sight. The non-sights for Smithson were this very simple displacement of elements, bringing sculpture in nature, but bringing sculpture and the element of nature, whether it was sand, gravel, broken glass, within the museum, actually disrupting the purity of the museum by bringing nature inside the museum. Actually, as simple as it might seem, but with the work, A Rose for Democracy, you bring water in the museum. Water is dangerous for art. So for many years, actually museum curators working with living artists had to fight, I would say, what is a dictatorship of the registrars and the conservator to be able to bring natural element in the galleries, because an accident might happen. The water might fall of a painting, like the stain we have in the other gallery. Something happened, an accident happened that might have impacted the work of art. So bringing natural element in the gallery is actually not only an aesthetic gesture, but it's a gesture of disruption. And you have that with the work by Cildo Meireles here, where he actually brought earth in the gallery, but it's not simply bringing earth in the gallery. It's also political. It's bringing geography and the politics of mapping and the politics of geography in the museum. In this beautiful leather suitcase, you have actually two different quality of earth, of soil, of two different color, one red, one gray. And this soil actually is coming from Brazil. Cildo Meireles is a Brazilian artist. These two quality of soil are attached to two very specific and politically and historically informed location in Brazil, but is mixing them up. You have this little chamber in the suitcase. Half is this red earth soil, the other one is this greenish gray soil, but they have these two little chambers, like a yin and a yang, that integrate these two quality of earth. And by integrating the two quality of earth, is trying to integrate demographics, to break through through the social and historical barrier in Brazilian history and reality. So it's really a work, like many Brazilian artists, it's coming out of a tradition that one of the leaders was Elioti Sica, to actually disrupt this notion of exclusion. You have a wall in between. So these two soils represent an historical reality in Brazil that do not connect with each other. And by bringing them together, the attempt is actually to reconcile and disrupt the separation, the opaque political, social separation within the country. And we're going to start with this one by the American sculptor, Robert Grosvenor. It's a beam. It's a wooden beam that is on the floor, as if we would have forgotten the object here. It's actually a sculpture. Of course, it goes from there's a tradition of both minimal sculpture, artists like Carl Andre just using ready-made industrial material to produce the sculpture, the tradition of minimal sculpture. And we'll see that a little bit later with the artist Bob Morris. But it's a little bit more than that. Actually, if you look at the work itself, it's actually more layered, I would say sophisticated than that. I like to see it as minimalism with a twist. Minimalism with in French we say déhanchement, with a contrapposto, as the beam itself has this kind of torsade, this movement into it, and the manufacture wound inflicted on the piece of wood, these cracks that appear at the beginning and at the end of the work. Again, it's a piece that invites you to look harder and closer to see where the decisions are made. And opposite to it, you have this main courante. In Portuguese, you say corrimão. So it's a ready-made object too, but it's a little like we had the body with Alberto Carneiro, and here the body disappeared. But you will see that this corrimão will actually run through the show, as they mark every gallery that we have, not almost every gallery, but they create this rhythm in the exhibition. And you will see it in the midway through the exhibition. It's by an artist, a Spanish artist named Juan Munoz, for whom the body was very important. But here, what the work is framing is actually the absence of the body.